All right, you ready?
I'm ready.
You're doing. This is Suffering in Silence with your host, Dr. Larry Walthour, coming to you live from the broadcasting booth. We're back tonight, and we're so grateful to be a part of this conversation. We are thankful tonight for have you to join in. Tonight, I got my good friend and brother, good friend. We've been friends for a while now, and he's our brother from another mother. Tom Brier. He's an attorney at law here in Pennsylvania, and he's also a former congressional candidate for the 10th Congressional District here in Pennsylvania. So we're so grateful to have him on tonight. And tonight we're talking about a country in crisis. We got so much going on tonight, and our country is in a crisis. We see what is, we have a candid conversation, how we got to where we are, what we can do to turn this thing around, and where we go next. And so I'm going to allow my good friend, this is not his first time being with us. He's been on this broadcast. So we're looking for how you doing?
I'm doing good, Pastor. It's nice to be back with you. These are always my favorite conversations to have, just because how much we both, appreciate history and I recognize the importance of this. So it's a treat to be with you.
Man, it's always a pleasure. I see you got the books and you're in the library, man. You're doing a late night.
I am. Got a late night tonight, but got the nice setup for it. I have more books than silverware, pots and pans, which I don't know what that says about me, but I got a nice setup
Man,
for it.
it's so great to see. And for those who are tuning in tonight, you can send us your feeds, your comments. We do have a banner feed, and you can just type in your comments, and we will definitely get your comments on live. And so tonight, our conversation is a country in crisis, and we know we just came on the backside of a grueling election. We see that this country is very divided in terms of what's going on in our Congress and in our electorate, and just so many things, so many moving parts. And so I want to talk about authoritarianism, because really the country, I think, Tom, what this has really revealed is that how fragile our democracy is. That democracy is a very fragile institution, and if we take it for granted and we're not really informed about how democracy works. And so I want to talk about democracy, historical context, and how democracies rise and fall. I know we've talked about this, and particularly there are three ways that a democracy can become a dictatorship. And one of those ways is by foreign invasion, in terms of a country going to war, and then the power that really is the victor takes over that country and changes the government. And some of those particular instances, Nazi Germany in World War II, the countries that they invaded were France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Denmark. And those countries came up under dictatorial rule up under Adolf Hitler. Talk a little bit about the fragility of a democracy and how, if the people don't understand it, we can get to where we are now.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. And one of the reasons I decided to major in philosophy in college was because I took an ancient philosophy class my junior year. And one of the first books we read was Plato's Republic. And in the 8th book of the Republic, he talks about how all governments have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Whether it's Babylon or Greece, it doesn't matter. If you look at history, there's always an end date. And so it fascinated me to think about when's the middle? When do you cross the middle, and when do you begin decline? And what Plato says is that the decline, whether it's a democracy or any form of government, begins when citizens pursue their own self-interest over the common good. Democracy requires you to look out for your neighbor, to be concerned about other people. And it's when you lose that essence of citizenship, that democracy begins to crumble internally. And you can look, even the founders, they studied Cicero and Livy and the Roman philosophers who were alive during the fall of Rome, and they said the same thing. It's when individuals become so self-centered and they lose regard for truth that democracy itself begins to collapse. And I think that's the same in Mussolini's Italy. It's the same in Hitler's Germany. And I don't think Plato would be surprised to know that Germany and Italy were both democracies when they declined into tyranny. And so we're in a situation right now where, even though the election, Joe Biden winning, I think is a step back from the brink, we have this very perilous circumstance where we've seemed to have lost our essence as a country. What does it mean to be an American? What does it mean you do as a citizen? And when it becomes about tribalism and assumes this cultural intensity, it really becomes difficult to overcome. And I think we're at that.
Wow. You talk a little bit about historical context, how those um, about the beginning, the middle. In our democracy, I mean, we're really a young democracy. I mean,
Right.
a little more than 200 years. And when you look at in terms of world civilization, we're a very young democracy. Based on your context of history, where do you think we are? I know, and we're going to talk more about what we've experienced for the last 4 years, because it's not really about being a Republican or a Democrat. What we really saw was authoritarianism come to this country. We saw the brink of a dictatorial regime in this country, where democracy, as we know it, was and still is at risk. So, where do you think we are along that continuum? Do you think we're somewhere in the middle? Do you think we're teetering?
Well, first, I think it's important to define what authoritarianism is. And, it's not so much an ideology as it is a reality. And so Hannah Arendt is probably the most famous philosopher of authoritarianism. She wrote after the fall of Nazi Germany, and she defines it as a state of mind where citizens are capable of believing anything and nothing at once, where you will listen to what one person tells you, irrespective of the truth of what he says. It is a total blind faith in a ruler, and we have that right now. I think that's authoritarianism by definition. Whether if you read George Orwell in 1984, that's what it comes down to, is a total disregard for reality. And right now we're operating in a system where the president of the United States is creating a narrative that's entirely fabricated and manufactured about a fraudulent election. That's never happened before in our country. And there are potentially 77 million people who believe him. And so we're confronted with a situation where we have two swaths of citizens operating on entirely different facts. And that's what authoritarianism requires. You have to be in a state of delusion for authoritarianism to work. And we seem to be there right now. I don't think it's, uncurable, but it's worrisome to know that your neighbor might not think the same things as you do on a common assumption of fact. And I think technology amplifies that to a degree that we've never actually seen. I really do think it's worrisome.
I think most of the electorate get their news from Facebook and social media platforms rather than
Over half.
reputable news outlets. You're very, very correct. Everybody's getting their narrative of truth, and when you talk about how Facebook and these platforms work with the like, when you like button, and and like doesn't necessarily mean that you like something. What they do, they feed you information based upon your likes. And so when you're getting a particular feed of information that reinforces what you already have established as a truth, even though that truth might be erroneous, you become emboldened to that information. And I think you're right. That's where we are. And when you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, I thought about the proverbial Nero fiddling as Rome burned, and and there's no real basis of not that really more legend than truth, but it's very fitting because in terms of the imagery, we have a pandemic raging across this country, and it looks like those who are in power is just fiddling. They're fiddling as this nation burns. We're getting record numbers of COVID cases. Record numbers of the Midwest is burning. Hospitals are capacity. They're literally fighting for their lives to the point where sick nurses are being asked to come to patients. And those who are in power are just fiddling a narrative that's just not true. And you're right. They just came out, Tom, with a report that said every electoral official in the 50 states said there was no electoral fraud. That just came out today, and that's unprecedented. Every electoral official from all 50 states said that there was no evidence of fraud whatsoever, that this was a free and fair election, and you still have that narrative in the face of all that truth being pushed out. And unfortunately, you got those that believe democracy become a dictatorship, and that is internal imposition, where you have facts within the government and you have facts within the democracy that have become disillusioned with democracy, and they began to implode from within. Talk about how that could also lead to where we are when you look at the current political system and how one party has for the last 4 years really emboldened this type of behavior. And to me, it's not about Republican versus Democrat. This is about an ideology of democracy versus fascism or a dictatorial regime, and how one particular party over the last 4 years have really emboldened us to get to where we are now. And I think that's a good example of internal imposition.
I think that's exactly right. And it's well said. And, we can go back to in our own history and look at how this plays out. The Civil War, the country split, right? Because of an inherent divide on what the future should look like. It was irreconcilable that they literally broke off and formed their own country. They fought a war over it. And now I think it's not an embellishment to say that we are at a similar position now, where I think there's a large swath of voters out there who have been led to believe that the alternative to Donald Trump is so horrific that it can't possibly be considered American. And that's a perilous position to be in. The problem that we have, though, is how do you have a dialogue about these issues? It's one thing to indict Trump and his enablers, but the voters are people you have to engage with. And there has to be a common conversation about these issues. And it's a difficult one, but I think you're right. The concern has to be internal decay and constitutional rot. And, you can look at money in politics, you can look at social media, you can look at mass media. I think all play a role in the way we talk to one another and we view one another. We don't have a rehabilitative mindset. We don't view things sympathy or empathy or compassion. It tends to be very one-sided and us versus. And I think until we change our culture and our sense of morals, then I think this will probably continue.
I think you made a valid point. It's scary, Tom, to see where we are, because I remember growing up learning about civics, 3 branches of government, the judicial, legislative, the executive, and how, we had 3 co-equal branches of government. And to see the decay that has taken place, and we didn't get here over the last 4 years. This has been building. We've been seeing this take place for the last, I would say, maybe 15 to 20 years. This trajectory of of the polarization of politics, and we're so polarized where compromise is no longer an issue in American politics, either my way or no way. We saw that with the rise of the Tea Party. We saw that with when you talk about the Southern strategy and how that came about, and the Dixiecrats left the Democratic Party, went over to the Republican Party, and then the president at that time, Lyndon B. Johnson, famously said that we've lost the South for a decade. We see
He said
happening.
100 years.
And even you went back to the Civil War, which is the origin of everything. So how do we get out of this? Because next area, and I know you are an attorney, I know you know history, and the next area I think is very chilling, that the third way a democracy can fall is constitutional takeover. And that's basically undermining the Constitution to the extent that unconstitutionality no longer exists. And that's scary for me. So talk a little bit about what that entails and how we can get back off the ledge from where we are now.
I mean, I think Joe Biden winning is the first step, right? This conversation would be much different if he had lost. And so, that's really a massive change that's happened. But that can't be the only thing that we do. I mean, it has to be broader than that. And I think it has to be getting money out of politics, to be bringing civics back to the schools. It has to be changing the way we talk to one another. And it comes down to whether the Republicans, I think, will continue to accept Trump as the head of the party. And I think Trump's setting himself up to be, these allegations of fraud. I actually was reading the transcript yesterday in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, where Trump's attorneys from a law firm called Jones Day were asked directly by the judge if there was any concrete evidence of fraud, and they said no. Plain, clear language that there's been no allegations of fraud, and yet they're still running with this idea that there has been, that the election itself is fraudulent, and the fact that the Republican Party hasn't really called that out is troublesome. But we can't sit back and be complacent with getting Joe Biden in office, because that's when I think, I'll never forget when James Carville, after Barack Obama won in 2008, said that the Democrats will control the country for the next 50 years. And then in 2010, they suffered the worst midterm loss in half a century. And so it's not a time to be complacent, it's time to work even harder, because, it's just as important now as it was 2 weeks ago.
What's hard for me to wrap my mind around is how voters can vote for what we're seeing when everything that we're seeing is undemocratic. When you talk about the assault on healthcare, and so many of these policies, with the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare being struck down, and 20 million Americans, losing their health care. And many of those people are Republicans. They are rural white brothers and sisters who, if this policy takes place, they're not going to have coverage. Pre-existing conditions and all these things that they have access to now will be totally eradicated. And yet there's a tendency to vote against our best interests. And I know as an attorney, you see things, and I know you understand psychology. Help our viewers try to wrap. How is it that voters can continue to vote for somebody like a Mitch McConnell, who's an obstructionist? It's not about politics, but when you obstruct a president over a rightful Supreme Court appointee, and then within 8 weeks, you ram a justice on the Supreme Court just to get power. To me, that's beyond politics now. You're talking about reprehensible behavior that undermines the fundamental of our democracy, which helps facilitate to where we are now. How is it that people can continue to vote against their best interests in these candidates?
I mean, that's the $64,000 question. And it's tough one to answer. I think at a very fundamental level, it comes down to education. Kentucky is the most underfunded state in the country for public
Yes.
school. And so,
Yes.
if we're not teaching students what is there, like, you have to understand what is in your self-interest to be able to act on it. And if you're not taught the basic, components of democracy, then we can't blame them for voting against it because there's no education in the first place. And so it has to start with education. And then beyond that, there really is a deep psychological component to politics. And, part of that today is something that the Republican Party identified 50 years ago, where it's latching on to really visceral cultural issues like abortion and gun rights and co-branding them with the party as a whole. And so when those become your operating political views, everything else becomes secondary. You'll vote only on those issues. And when you vote according to an ethos and a culture and not an ideology or a philosophy, it is very simple. You don't actually consider the other side because you don't consider them to be part of your team. And I think, if we go back to Robert Kennedy, he was the first Democrat in a long time to go to Mississippi and Alabama and Kentucky and the Rio Grande and walk through Texas and, went to real poverty where Democrats don't go today, and tried to make that connection and overcome that, I think, misperception of what the Democratic Party is. Because right now we're just playing into the hands of the Republicans by being who they say we are. And until we change the narrative there, I think we'll continue to struggle in elections.
Listen, Suffering in Silence. I'm your host, Dr. Larry Walthour, live on Facebook feed. We're also on YouTube and on other social media venues. And I got my good friend Tom Brier. He's an attorney here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And he's really just having a great conversation about how democracies become dictatorships and how fragile our democracy really is and where we are as a country. We've been talking about how democracies fall. If you're watching on Facebook, you can give us comments and we will get your comments on the air and we will answer your questions. I will pose your questions to him directly. If you have anything that you want to share to this conversation, we will definitely make sure that your words are expressed. Tom, you just said something about the narrative of politics, how people, if they look at it from a perspective of an ethos rather than an ideology, I think that's what you said, that we become conditioned, so to speak, to vote a certain way. That we have this one particular issue or these two particular issues, and that becomes the foundation for everything. So now I dismiss the side is saying, although what they may benefit me.
Yeah, well, there was a study done recently, Pastor, that shed light on this, and it was a neurological study. And they said that your political identity is the same as your religious identity. The way you view yourself is the same part of your brain governing really who you are, politically as well as culturally as well as religiously. So when you ask somebody to change their political views, asking them to change who they are and how they were brought up, just as you would be asking somebody to change their religion. And so when we're asking somebody to change their political views, I think we have to recognize how much of an ask that. Lincoln said after the Civil War, if he was asked if he would shake hands with the Southerner, and he said, well, if they'll shake hands with me, then of course. It has to be an acceptance of the fact that you are in many ways the product of your own genetic makeup. And it can't be this raw intensity when we talk to one another. We have to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and think about what life would be like if we were raised in a different area. And I think once you do that and you personalize those interactions, it becomes easier to find common ground. But the Democrats, as much as the Republicans, I think, operate on this assumption that the other side is morally less than what we are. And once you adopt that mindset, there's no common ground. It's impossible.
Wow, that's a powerful insight. As a pastor, as a preacher, you make that connection. It becomes a little more easier to understand, because I talk about this all the time, particularly with my religious convictions. It helps drive my theology in terms of candidate, as we are relates to loving mercy, doing justice, and walking before God. That's the foundation, I believe. And when I talked with you and we shared, immediately I realized I connected with you because I saw you, number one, as a person who loved mercy, a person that did what was right and right wrong when you came across them, and you have a humble disposition toward God and others. I think you find candidates that reflect that. They may not be religious per se, but they're at a place where God can touch them. They're at a place where they can be moved. They have a moral compass toward what is decent and right. And I think in our politics today, we're missing that. I oftentimes tell people, and I said this to you, you remind me so much of Robert and John Kennedy, when you were running. I always make that comparison, because of how you just gravitated to people and how people gravitated to you, and you were able to make that common touch. And I think we've missed that today. But in terms of the constitutional take, which is really, and you see the Constitution of the United States being pushed in this interim, in this election. We just had a free and fair election. We see for the first time in the history of our country no transition of power. The country is polarized. We now have a crisis. The winner of the election is being denied access to certain information, contacts, and really being blinded in terms of what you're coming into. And the politics have now become personal, and that personality have become is putting all of us at risk. So we see our Constitution being pushed in ways that's never been pushed before. And we'll talk about this a little later, because technically what's being done is not illegal based on the Constitution in terms of the Electoral College and what's taking place. So there is some legality to this, but because of the resistance of a smooth transition of power, it's polarizing this nation to a point where the damage might be irreparable, or we may be trying to undo this for the next generation. So we talked about Constitution. Now I want you to help me up ages of how a democracy falls. So the ways, but there are some stages, and I want you to talk about is that's the first stage of democracy falling, where a candidate identifies their platform not in the narrative of a political agenda, but a personal movement. Talk a little bit about that and the parallels we see with what's going on today.
Well, the first thing that Hitler did when he took power was he passed the Enabling Act, which gave him plenary power over Parliament and essentially destroyed the Constitution in Germany and made him a king. And he used the pretext of, the Jews burning down the Reichstag, which wasn't true, to pass that. But it was the legal change that gave him the constitutional authority to start putting people in ovens. I mean, literally, it was a legal basis for what he was doing. Right now, I think we still have. It shows the strength of our Constitution to see how durable it's been. I mean, it survived a civil war, it survived World War, it survived remarkably intense racial and ethnic and religious tension, and it survived Trump so far. It's been challenged, but I think he's trying to delegitimize it in a way that he's not quite capable of because of how strong our government is. But that being said, we have yet to see what will happen if and when he decides he's not going to leave, and that he is the rightful winner of the election, because the Constitution doesn't provide for what happens in that. And that's the worrisome. And I think people sometimes think that it's a little alarmist to think that could happen, but you have to take somebody at their word. And when they say that there's been a fraudulent election, you have to assume that they are going to act on that belief. And the Constitution at that point becomes secondary, because it doesn't actually govern something that's not true. I'm not sure what would happen in that circumstance.
That's been what I've been concerned about. I haven't really said it. I've just been in my private time. The what if. Because action that I see isn't there is no departure. The moving on with the budget. The budget department has been instructed basically to follow the budget of the outgoing administration. You see the Defense Department, you see the Justice Department, you see these different departments being replaced, and not necessarily something you do lame duck session. That's not something that's normal. We've never seen a outgoing president do these type of things, particularly with our national security, the cyber security, the Department of FBI, Department of Justice. These issues that are supposed to be apolitical. We see the position of these and ongoing administration and activity is as there is no departure. And for me, that's troubling because you're right. There's not really governs a president that lost an election that refuses to lead. And if it occurs, we're literally in a constitutional crisis that we've known before. And the trouble is the inactivity of the fellow Republicans to mandate that we have a free and fair election, and this has to come to an end. We don't see that happening, and the longer this goes, the more dangerous it becomes. And we're getting to a point where I think it's almost a a return. So we talk about the political movement, and we see the "Make America Great Again." It wasn't just a slogan. It really became a movement. It became a sweeping manifesto across this. My brothers disenfranchised by the direction that the country was going. And so the "Make America Great Again," for people like me, I heard a different message. I didn't hear, making America great again. What I heard was taking us back to a place where the white establishment felt America was great. And people that talked about this, that was 1954, before Brown versus the Board of Education, before Roe versus Wade, before the Civil Rights Act, before the Voting Rights Act, before the Fair Housing Act, before all those things. That's what America was to many. And many in Congress, our politicians, they still adhere to that ideology, that was the good old days of segregation, as was mentioned by Lindsey Graham. So we still have these politicians that hold to the ideology that segregation and Jim Crow was the glory days, that the Confederacy was the glory days of this country. And that's very threatening to democracy. So after we have this political movement, the is that national events and to shape our own truth. A bit of that.
Pat, can you repeat the last part of your question? I lost you there for a second. Just the last part.
The second phase of democracy collapsing is that we ignore truth and rational arguments and use the media or social media or media outlets to frame or construct our own truth.
That's exactly right. And if you look back to one of the examples I talked about in the campaign all the time, Watergate, where the entire country got their news at 6 o'clock on a weeknight from Walter Cronkite. And so everybody was operating more or less on the same common nucleus of fact. Whereas now you can live in an echo chamber, whether you know it or not, and live in a reality that, whether it's true or not, is comforting to your worldview. And democracy requires there to be a common basis of fact. You can't have a discourse about an issue when you have people coming at it from different realities, right? It's simply impossible. And so I think regulating social media, recognizing that, mass media, I've stopped watching cable news because I don't find any value in it. It's not discussion, it's entertainment. There's a big difference between the two. And we have to go back to just basic discourse, whether that's town lyceums or conversations like this, or group gatherings, or, some kind of societal function where we talk to one another and aren't in this one-sided, just constant fire hose of outrage all the time, because it's warped our psychology in a way that I don't think we're capable of actually dealing with. And I really do think that unless we change the way we digest information, we can't change our political system.
Clarity to so many complexities in the political process and help us see it in a way that is humane. And I think, we just see things in this world today through our own narrative, and my truth is not necessarily your truth, and everybody has their own version of truth. Um, and which leads to the next stage of a crumbling democracy, and that is to constantly lie. Um, Constantly the lie, no matter how egregious it is, because the more you spread the lie, the lie and major component to the fall and collapse of democracy. And if there's one thing that we've seen over the last years is a bombarding of other narratives, untruths, just lying. It's just lying. Um, COVID, so many other areas, but that is a fundamental threat to democracy. Talk a little bit about that.
No, you're right. And I read a study recently that said that 50% of Republicans believe in the QAnon conspiracy, which, if people aren't familiar, essentially says that the Democrats are operating a pedophilia ring for some nefarious purpose. I don't really know the details of it, to be honest. That is a degree of delusion that we've never seen before. And it's incredibly worrisome. I don't know how you cure that, other than to have somebody in office who's inherently trustworthy. And what Trump does is he foments that type of worldview, and makes it worse. And so you're right. When you default to lying, when facts become inconvenient, so you ignore them, and you create your own construct that's independent of reality, then you, by definition, can't have a democracy. And so I really do think that we have to figure out a way to put the genie back in the bottle with the way we are conducting ourselves. We're just not capable, I don't think, of handling this type of human interaction. It's just unsustainable.
One of the most threatening things to me, Tom, and I'm not sure now. One of the scary things for me is that you mentioned they have candidates that have elected state, local, and federal government who bring these ideologies to the public platform of governance that I think be very we try to come out of because one of the things that we were taught to believe in was in the principles of democracy. We knew it wasn't perfect, and we knew we had to do our part to make a more perfect union, that every generation was required to make the union more perfect for the next. But with these fringe conspiracy theorists getting into the halls of Congress and bringing that ideology to the public discourse of governance, and we see that with how COVID has been handled because now you're talking about herd immunity and it's a hoax, it's going to go away. And now we see this pandemic. Scientists were saying that they weren't. These two realities. How, what, how do we turn this around?
Well, I think it comes down to holding our public officials to a higher standard. It's trying to get new people involved in the political process. I mean, I think what Stacey Abrams right now is doing in Georgia might very well save the country. If we win the Senate and Joe Biden has Congress to pass laws that really can try to change the trajectory of Iran, it'll be in large part because of Stacey Abrams. And what she has done and what the Democratic Party does is funnel millions of dollars to candidates for TV ads. It didn't work. Democrats lost everywhere. They lost in central Pennsylvania. They lost in New York, California. The down ballot Democrats didn't do well. And that's because the Democratic, I think, approach is severely flawed, except for Stacey Abrams, because what she does is she creates an excitement for civics. She brings people together. She focuses on commonalities. She makes it personal. She makes it fun. And she's someone who does it in a way that generates real excitement. And I think when you change the way people think about politics and make people realize that you have a lot in common with people you might not otherwise interact with, you will be more aligned in the type of candidates that you support, because there's a much more and a much deeper, I think, humanity when you engage civically, like the way that she's doing in Georgia. And I think that has to be the model going forward, is creating a new structure of government and a new form of citizen that is engaged in the political process, because simply being a bystander at this point is unacceptable. You have to be engaged.
What I appreciate, we had the ballot march here in York during the election, and that came engaging conversation that you had, and it was a great success to make that a part of the process of keeping alive and keeping the ballot as the basis, the fundamental of our democracy. Our good friend and brother John Lewis, and I know that was your icon, said that the is the most powerful nonviolent tool we have in a democracy, and if it's sacred, it's precious, we must use it, because if we don't, it can be taken away. And we see that he was prophetic. That we see there's this attack on the ballot. There's this attack on suppressing minority votes. There's an attack on question, the black African American vote in Pennsylvania, particularly from Philadelphia and the suburbs, Pittsburgh, Michigan, Georgia. You talked about Stacey Abrams, Wisconsin. And so this whole talk about illegitimate votes, and I've been saying this, it's code language. It's not about illegitimate votes. It's about people of color. It's about questioning the power of minority who overwhelmingly voted in this election in numbers in those areas, particularly like never before. I mean, states. So this code language and this politicalization of where we are. You mentioned something you don't watch cable news. And I want to talk about this because one of the things about a democracy falling is discrediting the press. If you can discredit the press and oppress free speech, then you can begin to shape a narrative of public discourse. Talk about the danger of discrediting the press and oppressing free speech in this country, in our democracy.
Yeah, well, there's a reason the First Amendment is the First Amendment. Freedom of press is the greatest defense to tyranny. If you look at Russia, there is no freedom of press. There's no check on the government. The government controls the press. And so the freedom of press is a necessary prerequisite to truth, which is the foundation of democracy, right? It's the First Amendment. And so when you attack the press, you attack truth, which undermines democratic structures. And so, when I say I don't watch cable news, I don't mean to suggest that I don't believe all cable news. And there are degrees, there's InfoWars and Alex Jones, and there's, which is an entirely different reality than CNN. But what I struggle with is the lack of education I derive from watching the news. I don't actually feel as if I'm gaining anything. I feel like I'm being talked to. And having run for office and met some of the talking heads, good people, I have nothing against any of them, but they're not necessarily more informed than me and you. They're not reading or talking to voters or really, I think, engaging at a fundamental level of what's going on, boots on the ground. And so for me, I'd rather talk to people. I'd rather read and get nuance about the issues. I don't like being preached from someone who I don't think knows exactly what they're talking about. And I realized, again, watching the election results come in the past week, how much I hated just the manner in which the sensationalized narrative is presented to it, because it's not interactive, it's not pedagogical, it's inherently one-sided, and I don't think that's productive at all, at least not to the degree that we use it today.
So, what alternative news sources do you use? Do you just go to certain cable news sites? You read the paper?
Well, I have subscriptions to The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and This Week, or The Week, is a magazine that kind of recaps weekly news. And then, I kind of curate my news feed to follow reporters who I trust and journalists who I trust. My favorite is Ed Luce for the Financial Times. He's my favorite political commentator. But I try to go, trust is everything. You have to trust your, and I think what those publications do, they get chastised for it sometimes, but they correct themselves when they're wrong. It's a wonderful thing to see the New York Times issues a correction, because they're acknowledging that we're trying to do and abide by the truth. And I think we have to respect institutions that do.
You when you talk about the fall of democracy, and then we're going to get to the Constitution, there's another stage, which is stage number 5, and that is create an ideal authoritarian, the strong person, the population of the to want to be like. And one thing is, after being diagnosed with COVID and went back to the White House, stood on the steps leading up to the upper level, took off the mask before the cameras, strength, and you see this outbreak in the White House, where people's lives were put at risk, and began to come out saying that they were instructed no mask allowed. It's just, as things leaked out, and this image of strength to project on the public, I thought was very chilling. And I'm bringing this up because I'm not talking about a party. I'm talking about a personality. This is not about the Republican Party. It's not about the Democratic Party. It's about a person who is neither Republican nor Democrat. The Republican, Ronald Reagan could not be a Republican in this party. He would not be elected. Um, George Bush, H and George W. Bush in this Republican Party elected. This is not the party of Lincoln. Something totally different that has evolved, and I'm interested in your take on how can we put the genie back in the bottle in terms of what true strength is putting on a mask. True following the true strength is being disciplined, to care about your neighbor, to care about your fellow American, to care about your fellow citizen. So talk a little bit about what we might be able to do to turn the public discourse around toward the politicalization of what we're seeing with COVID-19.
Yeah, I mean, Pastor, you say it wonderfully. True strength is compassion. It's confronting the difficulty in life head on. It's recognizing that most people have it pretty tough. It's trying to make life better for those around you. It's confronting the facts when they're against you, and being honest about the challenges that we face. And I think the good thing is that if you look at history, Americans have responded positively. Robert Kennedy, and I use this line on the campaign all the time, he said when he announced his candidacy for president that he thought the American people were brave enough to be told the truth of where we stand. And I think the same. I think people actually crave the truth. They have to trust the messenger, and that's a different question. But I think if we bring in people who are trusted by voters and focus on not how to, pursue power, but to fix democracy at a very basic level, you can establish that trust. And I think once that happens, then you can change the way society views strength and power and respect, and make it humble and compassionate, and I think concern for everybody. And I think that's doable. We just have to find the right way to do it.
This is Silence. I'm host Dr. Larry Walthour, talking to my good having a conversation of the state of this country. We're at a place we've never been in our republic in terms of a smooth and peaceful transition. We're in areas of constitutional crisis, and we're not overstating this. And we're going to talk next couple of minutes about the constitutionality of where we are, about the Electoral College, about the popular vote, about the vote of the Electoral College, about the certification process, and what happens if this thing goes to the House of Representatives and winds up in the Senate. There is a process that's in the Constitution that a lot of people don't know about because we don't teach civics in school. And so we in an area where we've never been, where an outgoing president who's lost a election refuses to concede and may refuse to leave. What happens occurs. Where do we go? And so for those who are watching, we want to thank you for watching and being a part of this conversation. If you be a part, you can make sure to send us your comments or send us your questions, and definitely them on the air. Tom, the last two of the fall of a democracy is very. Step 6 is that you handle the power of established parties. You disrespect traditional norms. You undermine governmental institutions and elections. You create public mistrust towards democracy, and you tilt the judicial system and the military towards your favor. Where do you see us at now when we talk about what I just mentioned, these areas of dismantlement and creating public mistrust and suspicion in democracy?
Well, I think it's happening, and it's getting worse. I mean, it's kind of the Trump approach to politics is truth is secondary to power. And so you say and do whatever allows you to maintain your position in power. And I think Mitch McConnell's the same way. There was a good article in the New Yorker by Jane Mayer a few months ago that talked at length about how he views his role as majority leader in the Senate. And it is entirely amoral and transactional. There's no ethic that defines his core personality. It is all about power. And so we see that with the Supreme Court. What he decided years ago was that if he is able to stack the Supreme Court with conservative ideologues, then the conservative agenda would stay in place for decades. And that's what he did. And he didn't care if he was hypocritical about it. He didn't care. He had to lie to get there. He didn't care where the money came from. He didn't care who, honestly, I think, was the ultimate candidate for the positions that he wanted on those courts. But it was an entirely transactional way to get what he wanted. And when you view politics that way, when you take away the idea of compromise or the importance of an ideology, the common good, then you see what we have now, where the Supreme Court becomes politicized, police become politicized, civil servants become politicized, our election officials become politicized, everybody's mistrusted. There's no sense of community because you feel that you're in opposition to people. And I think that's what happens, like you mentioned, with the decay of institutions, because, and and Robert Kennedy talked about this. There's the assassination of the bullet, and there's the assassination of the institution. And when you have structural barriers to progress that are baked into the law, that is just as bad as physical violence, and it's more insidious in many ways, because it creates a culture that is inherently mistrustful of one another. And that's the position that we're in right now. And I think it's reforming those institutions and depoliticizing the ones that shouldn't be. That has to be a real focus in this next term.
When I first I'm sorry I cut you off. You froze on me. When I first met you, we had a conversation, and you said something that stuck out with me. We talked about absolute power, and you said, and I don't think I'll ever forget this. You said, Pastor Walthour, sometimes it's the loss of power that corrupts absolutely. Talk a little bit about that, because that really, really stuck out with me, and I think I'll take it to my grave that it's not always absolute power that corrupts. In some instances, it's the power that to corruption. Talk a little bit about that, because that's very powerful.
Well, yeah, it's there's that famous maxim from Lord Acton who said, "Absolute power corrupts absolutely." And what I've seen, and what I think is a little bit more really hones in on the issue, is not just power. You can have ethical power, but it's when that power is threatened that you see absolute corruption. When somebody who is in a position of power is so desperate to maintain it that they're willing to do anything. And you can see this with the mob. You can see this with certain religions in the course of history. You can see it with government officials. It's when there's an ultimate challenge to the status quo that it really becomes dangerous. And you and I talked about the tape recordings in 1974, right before Richard Nixon resigned, where he was talking to Henry Kissinger. He was drunk about dropping a nuclear bomb on Vietnam as a distraction to the impeachment investigation. That's core. You can't have a more corrupt thought than to kill several hundred million people so you can stay in office. I mean, it's unfathomable. And I think Trump has that same impulse where he has to do what's in the best interest for him. And the higher the stakes are, the more likely I think he is to push the envelope beyond legality to something that's really dangerous. And I think that's why, these next 70 days will be the defining era that we live in, because there has to be a peaceful transfer of power, because the opposite of that is chaotic. And I don't think it's out of the question to say that him losing power is so much of a challenge to his worth that he's willing to do whatever it takes to avoid it.
And I think we've politicized this unapologetically. I don't think he's a god, and he just happens to be in the Republican Party. But the ideals that he projects with conservative views. When you talk about the Ronald Reagan, I don't always agree with the Republican caucus, but I am a student of history, knowing the party back then and seeing what this party is today. It's like night and day. And the Democratic Party as well. There's been a shift in the Democratic Party as well. But this personality that has really embraced and embodied an entire party, I think even if he leaves, the residue of the influence is with us for years. You rightfully said you got 72 that voted, to go in a direction that we all know was obviously objectionable to democracy, but yet 77 million people voted to go down that road, and to me that is just chilling. And so about the erosion of the final stage is beginning to push your view of the country others. There was the sitting president made the comment about immigrants, particularly people who look like me, coming from Africa, coming from the blank hole countries. And then he asked the question, well, why can't we have more people coming like those in Norway? And so we have this narrative of what America is. Right now, America is a diverse, multicultural population of people from all walks of life. And we've talked about this, and I don't believe a country of immigrants. It's a country of Americans. It's a country of refugees, people coming to save their life to go back home. They're just seeking a country of immigrants, people coming from other places to get a better life. It's a country of colonizers. Our European brothers came now, but it's also a country of and we have to come to grips that they're not Semitic or people in this country. They're all walks of life. President that sees this country as one way, and that one way dismisses everybody else who's not a part of that view, it becomes dangerous. And that's what Hitler began to do when he began to purge the Jews. You talk about the Holocaust, and Italy had its Holocaust. And so we see this worldview that's being implemented, which was the final stage, and that's when the Holocaust came in. Talk about the danger of a worldview from a political leader and how that influence can begin to shape the public discourse toward others, and how.
Well, yeah, when you associate human beings with vermin and non-human things, it creates this visceral idea that you're somehow above them, right? And we saw that with Hitler. We see it with Trump. It's emphasizing the disgust of another group of people, so that you can somehow feel a sense of superiority to them. And it's something we have to be on guard. It's a human tendency to view outsiders as a threat. I think that's an innate feeling, is when someone you don't know comes to a place where you call home, and it's natural response to say, I don't know if I want that. And when what Trump does is he amplifies that to the nth degree. And you're right when you say that whether it's Mussolini or Stalin or Hitler, those were their core tactics. And it's the same with Putin. It's the same with, Saddam Hussein. These are authoritarian strategies to delegitimize and undermine other people. Whereas what we should be doing is the opposite, is emphasizing our common humanity, our common bonds, our common history, and the fact that what makes this country great is that, you and I can be close friends. And that's a wonderful thing. And it's just an unfortunate reality that we're in right now where that's not the emphasis. And I think, again, Joe Biden winning is a step in the right direction to reverse that. But it has to change because it's not the way we should view or talk to one another.
For those who are listening, this is Suffering in Silence. I'm your host, Dr. Larry Walthour, hanging out with my good friend, Tom Brier, good friend, good brother, attorney at law here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, former congressional candidate for the 10th here in Pennsylvania, and we're about the state of in this country. And we're just having a home conversation. This is just a public conversation, and we're on several venues. We're on social media. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube. We're on LinkedIn. Several lines of feeding tonight. And so we are just grateful for him. And so if you want to be a part of this conversation, you can give us your question in the chat or in the banner feed, and we'll be sure to make sure that your question is asked, and we'll try to answer accordingly. Tom, for we want to try to close this out. I know your time is very valuable, and I thank you for your time. I want to talk about the Constitution because, of course, we know that, and a lot of people don't know how the Electoral College works. Most democracies, we understand the majority win. And so here in America, we got the popular vote, and we have the electoral vote of each state. And, of course, we have to get a candidate to 270. And we know that the history of the electoral time, and it's from that time. It's a part of our. We all understand the popular vote. I understand that's the majority. Why? And we saw that. I think right now Biden leads 5 million votes. Hillary Clinton won the popular. Gore, I believe, won the popular vote in this country. Still lose the election because of the electoral. So help our viewers who might not understand how this works understand the electoral process and the 270. And why understanding that is so important to gaining an election.
So the Electoral College is the setup that our framers adopted in their minds as a check on the popular vote, as a way to kind of somehow have some control over what the majority would do. And what it says is that each state is given, based on their population, a certain number of electors. And those electors cast their vote for the nominee who wins the popular vote in that state. And so Joe Biden won Pennsylvania, which means he gets the 20 electors in Pennsylvania, and he needs a majority of those electors to win the nomination. And so, like you said, you can lose the popular vote. If you win California by 7 million votes, you get all their electors, but that margin doesn't actually help at the end of the day. And actually, 8 of the last 9 presidential candidates, or Democrats, have won 8 of the last 9 presidential popular votes. But George W. Bush lost the popular vote and still won, and so did Donald Trump. And in fact, John Kerry in 2004 was about 20 votes away from winning the Electoral College and losing the popular vote. Which I think, if that had happened, we might have gotten rid of the popular vote, or the Electoral College. It's been a bipartisan, struggle there. But it's antiquated. I think at this point it's clearly a barrier fairness. I mean, if it's like football, instead of saying that the final score should dictate who wins, you go by, how many rushing yards you had. So, or rushing yards, if you lose by 20, you win the game. It doesn't make any sense. So I think the Electoral College, in theory, was a worthwhile project. But today, to say that you can win by 3 million votes and not assume the nomination is irrational. It just can't be the case. And right now, Democrats have to win by about 4 percentage points of the popular vote to actually win the Electoral College based on the population breakdown. And it's the same in the Senate, which is why I'm an advocate for bringing in Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico as states, which would give, add 4 senators to the Congress. But for now, at least, that race to 270 and getting those electors, which, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida, Ohio, those are the key states nowadays.
So every state gets a certain number of electoral votes based on their population.
Right.
And so we have the election this year, November 3rd, 2020, votes. That's I vote, but that's not it, because in the Electoral College meets December 4th, I believe, or 13th.
Right.
The Electoral College meets. And before the Electoral College meets, every state must certify their election to make sure that the popular vote of the people in that state is certified. So talk about the certification process and then what takes place at the Electoral College, because that can get kind of dicey if we don't understand what happens after the general election. The general election is not it. There's some things that takes place in between the general election in November and the inauguration. About the certification, talk a little bit about the.
Sure. So you're right. Each state prescribes its own rules for how they cast their electors. Every state except for 3, I believe, Maine, Nebraska, and Alaska, maybe, are such that if you win the state, you get all the electoral votes for that state. And so the problem is that if, for example, Trump says that an election is fraudulent, it gives the legislature potentially, this is a debate constitutionally, but if you say that the actual results are not legitimate, then the legislature would subsume the role of the elected, and they would be the ones who decide which president gets that state's votes. And so in a state like Pennsylvania, which is a Republican legislature, it's plausible that the legislature would cast their votes for Trump, even though Joe Biden won the state. I don't think that's likely, but it's within the realm of possibility. And I think there has to be an awareness. Can you hear me?
I want to make sure. I wonder our listeners understand what you just said. Understanding where this can go. That even the people voted in this Commonwealth and any other, Wisconsin, Georgia, wherever won, and wherever Trump won, the reverse can take place. But if the election in that state can be determined and called fraudulent, then the legislative body assumes the role of the people. And in Pennsylvania, we have a Republican-controlled legislation, which means that if the Republican-controlled legislation determined that the election here was fraudulent, they can assume the role and give another slate of electors to go into that electoral and vote for Trump and override the will of the people. That's what you're saying.
So I'm saying it's possible. I'm not saying it's likely, but I think right now, you have to be eyes wide open.
No, it's not likely, but that is a legitimate possibility. It's called faithless electors. That's the general word for it. It's called the faithless electors or rogue.
The Trump campaign has voiced this as an option. I mean, this is something that's in the public sphere, right? I mean, the reason this is now a topic of conversation is because it's been put out by conservatives saying that, as plan C or D or E, whatever the case may be, there's always the option that we can go through the state legislatures in the states that we lose, and they can cast the electoral votes for us. And so this isn't conjecture. It's not, looking to see all possibilities. It's looking to see, Trump's campaign has said that this is an option. So you have to take it seriously.
That's why I believe the public really understands this. And technically, it is a loophole in the Constitution. It is a constitutional loophole. The likelihood of it happening, we hope that is not the case, but you're right. The campaign has put this out, not only here in Pennsylvania, but some other states as well. I believe in Georgia. In fact, the Republican Party in Georgia is asking their Secretary of State to resign because they're saying he wasn't fair to them in the election. And he's like, I'm telling you what the votes are. And it's almost like they want him to resign because he did not give them election votes. Didn't, we've never been before. An open defiance, fairness, open defiance of justice, the rule of law. This is something that we've never seen before. We've seen contentious elections, but this warfare of really trying to usurp elections is something new. And the fact that it was put out by the Trump campaign is chilling because it is a possibility. The likely, we don't know. But like you said, you have to begin to think like this until the Electoral College meets in December. So if that happens, you got the people thinking that their votes this way. And 14th, we find out that Trump won Pennsylvania because the Electoral College voted to give him the 20 electoral votes of Pennsylvania. Although the people said, we vote for Biden. What do you think that's going to do in the electoral process?
I hope people take to the streets.
I mean, I'm not trying to.
No, it's you're right to raise it. It's a legitimate concern. But I think we should temper our expectations a little and let's see how this plays out. If there's cause for concern, we'll act, right? But for now, being aware is the most important thing, and not overreacting. But
and that's exactly why I want to talk about this. That's exactly why I want to talk about this, because awareness is key to maintaining a democracy. You got to understand. You got to be aware. And I was always told people are crazy about doing something they'll say they're going to do until they do it. And I've learned to take people at their word. There's nothing that up to date. Something that it wasn't. So for our listeners, this is going to happen. What we're saying is that this has been talked about in public, both here in Pennsylvania and in where state senators and representatives to take the authority to cast the vote in the election, and that will put us in a constitutional crisis. So as we prepare to close out, if that happens, of course, the next phase, it goes to the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives confirms the president, and the Senate confirms the vice president. And talk a little bit about that, because in the Senate, they vote by state, so it's based upon the number of red states and the number of blue states in the Senate. And then in the House of Representatives, they vote based upon their body. So talk about what happens if this is up in the House of Representatives and or in the Senate, depending on the Electoral College.
Well, and I hate to cut this off early because I do have to jump here in a second, Pastor, but you're right. It's not, if that happens, the vote will be already prescribed. I believe it is prescribed in the Constitution. So if there is a challenge, then it's broken down by the number of congressmen in office. And so it's not according to the population.
Yes.
And in that case, you wouldn't even necessarily need a supermajority.
Yes, I'm sorry.
So yeah, the Congress could conceivably decide who the president is. But I'm going to end on that note because I don't think it's going to happen. We should.
I just wanted to bring it up because in this day and time, we have to. So listen, I want to thank you so much for joining us on tonight. It's always a pleasure. Anything you want to say to our audience before you leave?
Well, Pastor, thank you for having me. I always love talking to you, whether it's online or offline, and this is no different. I would just say, keep your faith in the system. Try to challenge yourself to be active, to pursue the truth where you can, to help your neighbor where you can, and value the system that we have, because it can be lost, and once it's lost, it might not be recovered. And I think we have to be aware of that going forward. But if we fix this, I think we'll be proud of that a few years from now. So just got to keep the faith.
As we get ready to close out, I want to thank Tom for your time tonight. And I want to say to all of our viewers, listen, we have a mandate to leave this union more perfect than what we inherited. This democracy is 200 plus years old. It's a young democracy. It's a fragile democracy, but it's our democracy, and we have to fight for democracy. That means that we have to fight for equity, justice, and liberty and justice for all. And so this conversation tonight is not about scaring you. It's about really informing you about what we learned about in school. The Constitution outlines certain things, but we're in a place and time in our history that we've never been before. And as I always say, it's not about the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. It's about people. We, the people of the United States, decide who we want to lead us. We have an election, and we have for power for the outgoing and the incoming administration. So, Tom, thank you so much for your voice. Platforms. You've been on YouTube, you've been on Facebook Live, you've been on LinkedIn Live. If somebody wants you, is there a way for them to reach out?
Yeah, same thing. Facebook, Tom Brier. I'm on all those same platforms. Respond to messages as soon as I can. So if you ever have any questions or want to chat, I'm out there.
I'm telling you, he's a busy man, so catch him while you can. Again, thank you so much for tonight. I'm your host, Larry Walthour. This has been Suffering in Silence. Remember, stay strong, keep the faith, and continue to hold on. We'll see you next week, same time, same place, on the Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn outlet. We'll see you next week. Peace.
All right, Pastor. Can you hear me?